I took the job at St. Laurent Penitentiary because I was broke, desperate, and figured an empty building couldn't judge me the way people did. After Houston fell apart, after the eviction, after watching my credit score plummet, after my brother got out and I realized I had nothing to offer him but disappointment, I came back to Louisiana with my tail between my legs. The ad said, night security, historical facility, minimal supervision required. It paid $13.50 an hour. I didn't ask questions. The prison squats in the southeastern corner of Vermilion Parish, where the highway gives way to gravel and gravel gives way to mud. You reach it by a two-lane access road that cuts through a cypress swamp so thick the canopy blocks out the sky even at noon. By the time I arrived for my first shift, the sun was already bleeding into the tree line and the mosquitoes were starting their evening chorus. The building itself looked like something that had grown out of the earth rather than been built on it. 3 stories of stained concrete and rusted iron wrapped in chain link and razor wire that hadn't been maintained in decades. A wooden sign near the entrance read St. Laurent Penitentiary, Esterne, 1923, historical tours available. Beneath it, someone had spray-painted closed in faded red letters. Captain Duval met me in the gravel lot, leaning against a pickup truck that looked older than I was. He was maybe 60, with the kind of face that suggested he'd stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. Gray stubble, tired eyes, a slight limp when he walked. He shook my hand without smiling. "You're Malik, then," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Come on. I'll show you around before dark. It's better that way." The interior of St. Laurent smelled like mildew, rust, and something older, something organic and patient. Duval led me through the main entrance, past a dusty reception area with yellowed visitor logs still stacked on the counter, into what he called the control center. A cinder block room lined with monitors, filing cabinets, and a desk that looked like it had been salvaged from a school. 24 small screens showed grainy black and white feeds from cameras scattered throughout the facility. Most showed empty corridors, barred doors, the occasional flicker of a moth crossing in front of a lens. During the day, we run tours through A Block and the old administrative wing, Duval explained, his voice flat and procedural. At night, it's just you. You'll monitor the cameras, log anything unusual, do a patrol at 2 a.m. and another at 5. Don't deviate from the schedule. Seems pretty straightforward, I said. Duval glanced at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Pity, maybe, or recognition. Then it was gone. He walked me through the layout. A Block and B Block were the main cell tiers, narrow corridors lined with 2-man cells stacked 3 stories high, connected by rusted catwalks. C Block was older, built in the 30s, a single-tier wing that had been used for disciplinary segregation. Beyond that were the areas we didn't talk about in the tour brochures. Death row, sealed since 1987. The execution chamber, which I only saw through a reinforced window. And Block E, a crumbling wing on the eastern side that had been condemned after a partial roof collapse in the 90s. The whole place was a maze of locked gates, dead-end hallways, and doors that opened onto nothing but darkness. Outside, the swamp pressed in on 3 sides, separated from the prison yard by a sagging fence and a crumbling perimeter wall. Through the windows, I could see stagnant water reflecting the last of the daylight, cypress knees jutting up like broken teeth. The air inside was thick and wet, the kind of humidity that made every breath feel heavy. "You don't go into C Block after hours," Duval said as we passed a reinforced door with a faded C stenciled on it. "You don't go into death row, period, and you never under any circumstances open any door in Block E. Those areas are off limits for safety reasons." He paused. "And other reasons." "Other reasons?" He didn't answer. Instead, he led me back to the control room where he pulled a laminated sheet from the desk drawer and set it in front of me. The heading read, St. Laurent Penitentiary, Night Security Rules, 00000. I scanned the list. Most of it was standard stuff. Log entries every hour, check perimeter fencing, maintain radio contact with dispatch. But mixed in with the mundane were entries that made the back of my neck prickle. Rule 2. If you hear count time called over the intercom after midnight, do not respond and do not leave the control room. Rule 4. Do not unlock any cell on C block after 1:13 a.m., even if you see an inmate inside on camera. Rule 6. If you hear footsteps on the catwalk above you while you're alone, do not look up. Rule 9. Never answer when someone addresses you as officer from the old death row wing. I looked up at Duval, expecting him to laugh, to tell me it was some kind of initiation prank they played on new hires. His face was stone. Is this a joke? I asked. No. Then what? Follow the rules, he said quietly, cutting me off. All of them. Exactly as written. Don't improvise, don't test them, and don't convince yourself there's a rational explanation, because the moment you do, you'll break one. And then you'll understand why I'm telling you this. He picked up his keys, his limp more pronounced as he headed for the door. This place still runs at night, Malik, just not for the living. I wanted to ask him what the hell that meant, but he was already gone, his truck crunching down the gravel drive, taillights disappearing into the gathering dark. I stood in the control room, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant drip of water somewhere deep in the building. Outside the window, the swamp was a solid wall of black. I looked down at the laminated rules again, at the careful, deliberate wording, and tried to convince myself it was just prison culture, morbid humor, a way to cope with working in a place where bad things had happened. I taped the sheet above the monitor bank just in case. By the time I settled into the desk chair, the last of the daylight had bled away, and St. Laurent Penitentiary belonged entirely to the dark. The first few hours passed in a kind of monotonous limbo. I logged my start time, cycled through the camera feeds, and watched absolutely nothing happen. The corridors stayed empty. The cell doors stayed closed. The yard remained still except for the occasional flutter of a bat crossing the sodium lamp. I could hear the building settling around me, the creak of old metal expanding and contracting, the whisper of wind through broken windows somewhere on the upper floors, the rhythmic drip of water that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tried to relax. I ate the sandwich I'd packed, scrolled through my phone until the signal died. Reception was non-existent out here, and told myself this was easy money. Duval was just old, probably superstitious, maybe a little traumatized by whatever accidents or incidents had happened here over the years. Prisons had reputations, they collected stories, it didn't mean any of it was real. At 12:17 a.m., I was watching the B-block camera feed, zoning out, when I noticed movement on one of the screens. I leaned forward. It was just a shadow maybe, or a trick of the light, but for a second, I could have sworn I saw someone walking along Tier 2. I switched to a closer angle. Nothing. Empty catwalk, empty cells. I made a note in the log. Possible shadow on B block Tier 2, 1217, investigated via camera. No anomalies. At 12:34 a.m., the intercom crackled to life. The sound was so sudden and loud in the silence that I flinched, knocking my pen off the desk. A burst of static filled the control room, and then a voice boomed through the speakers. Deep, authoritative, distorted by age and interference. Count time! Tier 1! Line it up! My heart kicked in my chest. I stared at the intercom unit mounted on the wall, a boxy gray relic that Duval had explicitly told me was offline at night. The wiring had been disconnected years ago, he'd said, after it started malfunctioning. There was no reason it should be operational. And yet the voice continued, echoing through the empty halls beyond the control room. "Count time. Stand at your doors." I looked down at the laminated rules. Rule 2, if you hear "count time" called over the intercom after midnight, do not respond and do not leave the control room. My body had already started moving. Muscle memory from a routine I'd never performed, some instinctive response to an authority I didn't recognize. I was halfway out of my chair before I caught myself. I sat back down hard, gripping the edge of the desk. My palms were sweating. "It's a recording," I told myself. "An old schedule loop. Some automated system Duval didn't know about. It has to be." But the voice didn't sound automated. It sounded impatient, irritated, like someone who'd called count 1,000 times and expected compliance. I forced my eyes to the monitors, scanning the feeds for C Block Tier 1. The camera was old, the image grainy and colorless, but I could see the long corridor clearly enough. A row of cell doors on either side, bars painted institutional beige, concrete floors stained with decades of use. It was empty. Then the image flickered. For just a second, maybe two, the feed changed. The cells were still there, but now there were people. Men in faded jumpsuits, standing at their doors with their hands on the bars, faces turned upward toward some unseen authority. I could see them clearly. 20, maybe 30 figures, perfectly still, perfectly aligned, like a photograph from another era superimposed over the present. I blinked, and the feed returned to normal, empty corridor. No one there. The intercom cut off abruptly, leaving only the hum of the monitors and the pounding of my pulse in my ears. I sat frozen, staring at the screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. Interference, I told myself. Overlapping footage, some archival tape bleeding through the system. It happened. Old equipment did weird things. There was probably a rational explanation, something technical, something Duval could clarify in the morning. But my hands were still shaking when I picked up the pen and logged the incident. Intercom activated at 12:34 a.m. despite being offline. Audio anomaly. Camera feed C Block Tier 1 experienced a brief visual distortion. I didn't write what I'd seen. I didn't want to see it in my own handwriting. The rest of the hour crept by in suffocating silence. I kept glancing at the C Block feed, half expecting those figures to reappear, but the corridor stayed empty. At 1 a.m., I logged the hourly check and allowed myself to breathe. The intercom stayed dead. The cameras showed nothing but stillness. Maybe it was a one-time glitch. Maybe Duval had been exaggerating, or maybe I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. Maybe... At 1:13 a.m., exactly as the log recorded it, a soft buzzing sound began to build through the control room. It was faint at first, like the hum of a distant fluorescent bulb struggling to stay lit. But it grew steadily louder, resonating in my teeth. I looked around trying to locate the source and realized it was coming from the intercom again. Not a voice this time, just that low, vibrating hum that made my skin crawl. On the monitor for C Block, something changed. Cell C12, near the far end of the tier, had its door ajar. I was certain it had been closed a moment ago. I rewound the feed mentally, trying to remember, but the image was already shifting, grainy and unstable, like the camera was struggling to focus. Inside the cell, barely visible in the dim light, I saw a figure sitting on the edge of the bunk. A man, head in his hands, shoulders slumped. The buzzing stopped. I stared at the screen, every nerve in my body screaming that this was wrong. There were no inmates here. Saint Laurent had been decommissioned in 2003. The building was empty, it had to be. But the figure didn't move, and the cell door stayed open, and somewhere deep in the building I heard the faint echo of metal scraping against metal. I looked down at the rules again. Rule 4. Do not unlock any cell on C Block after 1:13 a.m., even if you see an inmate inside on camera. The wording was specific. Deliberate. It didn't say there wouldn't be anyone inside. It said even if you see an inmate. I picked up the radio, my hand trembling, and keyed the mic. Duval, this is Hayes. You copy? Static. Captain Duval, do you copy? Nothing. The radio was dead, or the range was too far, or maybe he'd turned it off for the night and I was alone with whatever this was. On the monitor, the figure in C-12 slowly lifted its head. I couldn't see a face, just a dark silhouette against the darker gray of the cell, but I felt it looking at me, looking through the camera. The screen flickered again, and when the image stabilized, the cell was empty. The door was closed. The tier was silent and still, as if nothing had ever been there. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't log the incident. I just sat in the control room watching the monitors, listening to the drip of water somewhere in the walls, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. But the rules were still taped above the desk and the words were very, very clear. I didn't sleep well after that first shift. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flicker of those figures on Tier 1 standing at their doors, hands on the bars. I heard the voice calling count. By the time my second night rolled around, I'd almost convinced myself not to go back, but the reality of my bank account and the memory of Duval's tired face kept me from quitting. I told myself it was just nerves, just the isolation and the atmosphere of the place getting to me. Old buildings did that. They held on to their history. It didn't mean anything supernatural was happening. I arrived at dusk again, and this time I wasn't alone. A white panel van with Vermilion Parish Facilities Maintenance stenciled on the side was parked near the entrance, and I could hear the whine of a power drill coming from somewhere inside. Duval met me in the parking lot, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Ricky's here fixing a lock on the B-block gate," he said. "He'll be gone by 9. Don't let him talk you into anything stupid." "What does that mean?" Duval just shook his head and walked to his truck. I found Ricky Torres in the main corridor, kneeling in front of a rusted gate with a toolbox spread out beside him. He was maybe mid-40s, stocky, with a graying goatee and a southeastern Louisiana University cap worn backwards. When he saw me, he grinned and waved a wrench. "You must be the new night guy," he said. "Malik, right? Duval told me you started this week." "Yeah, that's me." "Welcome to the most boring job in Louisiana, my friend." He laughed, a warm, easy sound that felt out of place in the damp, oppressive silence of the prison. "You get used to it. The place looks creepy as hell, but it's just a building, concrete and rust. Ain't nothing here but rats and bad plumbing." I wanted to believe him. He had the casual confidence of someone who'd spent years working in a place without consequence, someone who'd seen it all and survived through sheer indifference. I envied that. "You ever see anything weird here?" I asked, trying to sound offhand. Ricky snorted. "Weird like what? Ghosts? Hell, man, every old prison's got ghost stories. Duval loves that stuff. He's been here so long he's half convinced the place is haunted." "Me? I've been in and out of St. Laurent for 15 years, and the only thing that ever scared me was the mold problem in Block E." He tightened a bolt and stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You worried about the rules, aren't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. He laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, man. Yeah, they gave you the ghost rules. That's Duval's thing. He hands that sheet to every new hire, watches to see if they take it seriously. It's like a test or something. I think he gets off on it." "So, they're not real?" "Real?" Ricky shook his head, grinning. "Buddy, half that stuff is just old prison superstition. Don't look up at the catwalk. Don't answer if someone calls you officer. It's spooky campfire bullshit. The place was a prison for 80 years. People died here, bad stuff happened, sure, but it's not haunted. It's just haunted adjacent. You know what I mean?" I wanted to tell him about the intercom, about the figures on the camera feed, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he laughed, or maybe it was the fear of sounding insane. Instead, I just nodded. "Relax," Ricky said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You'll be fine. Just follow the routine, keep your head down, and cash your checks. Easiest gig in the parish." He finished his work and packed up his tools, but he didn't leave right away. Instead, he followed me back to the control room, cracked open a thermos of coffee that smelled suspiciously like whiskey, and settled into the spare chair like he was planning to stay a while. We talked about nothing important. LSU football, the state of the roads, the misery of Louisiana summers. It was almost pleasant having another person there. The building felt less oppressive with Ricky's laughter echoing down the hallways. Then at 11:47 p.m., the intercom crackled. It was softer than the night before, a low, distorted hum followed by a voice that sounded distant and hollow. "Officer, you there? Cell C12 doors jammed. Been jammed all week." Ricky's grin faded. He set down his thermos and looked at the intercom unit. "The hell?" I felt my stomach drop. I pointed at the laminated rules, specifically at Rule 4. "Don't touch C block after 1:13, I said quickly. "Don't unlock anything." "It's not even midnight yet," Ricky said, standing up. He walked over to the monitor bank and studied the C block feed. "Look right there, C12, doors open a crack." I looked. He was right. The cell door was slightly ajar, and inside, barely visible in the grainy feed, I could see a figure sitting on the bunk, head in hands. Exactly like I'd seen the night before. "That's just a vagrant," Ricky said. "Or a homeless guy who snuck in during the day. Happens sometimes. I'll go check it out." "No," I said, standing up. "The rule says—" "The rule is bullshit, Malik." He grabbed a ring of old keys from a hook near the door and headed into the corridor. "I'll be back in 5 minutes. Watch me prove it." I wanted to stop him. I should have stopped him, but he was already gone, his footsteps echoing down the main hallway toward C block. I turned back to the monitors, my heart hammering, and switched to the camera feeds that covered his route. I watched Ricky walk down the corridor, whistling tunelessly, his shadow long and distorted under the dim emergency lights. He reached the reinforced door to C block, unlocked it with a loud clang, and stepped inside. The camera angle switched to the interior feed. A long, narrow corridor lined with cell doors, most of them rusted shut. C12 was near the far end, its door still open a few inches. Ricky walked toward it, slowing as he approached. He stopped in front of the cell, peering inside, and I saw him frown. On the feed, the bunk was empty. No figure, no one there. He turned back toward the camera, shaking his head, and keyed his radio. "Malik, you seeing this? There's nobody here, man, just shadows and—" The cell door slammed open. It happened so fast I almost didn't process it. The door swung outward with tremendous force, catching Ricky in the shoulder and slamming him backward into the bars of the opposite cell. He shouted in pain, stumbling, and the camera feed filled with static, thick churning interference that whited out the entire screen. I jumped to my feet, shouting into the radio. "Ricky, Ricky, answer me!" The static cleared. The corridor was empty. Ricky was gone. His cap lay on the floor near C12, but there was no sign of him. No body, no movement, nothing. The cell door was closed now, perfectly flush with the frame, as if it had never been open. "Ricky!" I screamed into the radio, cycling through every camera feed I had. "Where are you?" Static. Silence. Then faintly I heard something else, a sound so soft I almost missed it. It was coming through the building itself, through the walls, through the pipes, a slow, deliberate scraping like fingernails dragging across metal. It moved through the ceiling above me, traveling away from C block, deeper into the sealed sections of the prison, fading gradually into the distance until I couldn't hear it anymore. I stood in the control room staring at the empty corridor on the monitor and realized my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the radio. Ricky's truck was still in the parking lot when I checked. His tools were still in the hallway. His thermos was still on the desk beside me, coffee or whiskey gone cold. But Ricky Torres was gone. I didn't call the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I knew how it would sound. A man disappeared from a locked corridor in an empty prison while I watched on a camera. And I didn't have the energy to be interrogated, to explain the rules, to relive what I'd seen. Or maybe it was something darker, a growing certainty that the police wouldn't find anything, that Ricky had crossed a threshold into something beyond their jurisdiction. Either way, I sat in the control room for the rest of the shift, monitoring feeds that showed nothing, logging incidents I didn't understand, and waiting for dawn like a prisoner waiting for parole. When Duval arrived at 6 a.m., I was still sitting there staring at the empty C-block corridor. I'd replayed the footage a dozen times, and every time the same thing happened. Ricky approached the cell, the door slammed open, static filled the screen, and he was gone. There was no explanation. No rational process could account for it. Duval took one look at me and sighed, the kind of sigh that carries the weight of inevitability. "What happened?" he asked. I told him. Everything. The intercom, the figure in C12, Ricky's dismissal of the rules, the scraping sound in the walls. Duval listened without interrupting, his face growing older with every word. When I finished, he sat down heavily in the spare chair and stared at the monitor bank. "His truck's still outside," he said quietly. "I know. You didn't call anyone." "Who would I call?" Duval nodded slowly, as if that were the correct answer. "Ricky's been here a long time, longer than me. He stopped taking the rules seriously years ago. I warned him. More than once." He rubbed his eyes. "He's not the first." "The first what?" "The first person to disappear from C-block after 113. Duval stood and unlocked one of the filing cabinets along the wall, pulling out a cardboard box labeled Incident Reports Night Shift, 1975-2003. He set it on the desk in front of me. "If you want answers, they're in here. But they won't make you feel better." He left me alone with the box. I spent the next several hours reading through decades of reports, handwritten logs, and official memos typed on yellowing paper. The pattern was unmistakable. Every few years, someone, a guard, a maintenance worker, a custodian, reported anomalies during the night shift. Phantom roll calls, footsteps on empty catwalks, figures seen on camera feeds that vanished when investigated. Some of the reports ended with explanations: equipment malfunction, stress-induced hallucination, and atmospheric conditions. Others ended abruptly with the reporting officer transferred to another facility or listed as resigned for personal reasons. 3 reports stood out. August 14, 1981. Officer R. Landry responded to security alarm in C-block. Found cell C12 door open. No inmate present, attempted to secure the door. The door closed on its own, pinning the officer's hand. Severe fractures. Officer transferred to the Baton Rouge Regional Office. November 3, 1989, Custodian M. Broussard heard a voice calling from death row during overnight cleaning. Investigated despite the supervisor's instructions. Found unresponsive in the corridor the following morning. Cause of death: cardiac arrest. No prior history of heart conditions. June 22, 1996. Officer L. Thibodeau reported seeing full count on Tier 1 cameras after midnight. Refused to leave the control room. Subsequently filed for disability leave. Notes indicate the officer experienced severe psychological distress following the incident. The last name caught my attention. I dug deeper into the box and found a worn spiral notebook with night log Lieutenant J. Thibodeau written on the cover in faded ink. The entries spanned from 1979 to 1986, and the handwriting grew progressively more erratic as the years went on. Early entries were mundane: equipment checks, shift changes, maintenance notes. But around 1983, the tone shifted. March 12, 1983, heard the count called at 12:40 a.m., did not respond per protocol. Cameras showed Tier 1 fully occupied for approximately 90 seconds. Confirmed with day shift, no inmates housed in facility. April 2, 1983. Footsteps on catwalk during 3 a.m. patrol. Did not look up. Footsteps followed me to the control room, then stopped outside the door. July 19, 1984. They line up for the count every night now. Some of them weren't executed here, they just show up. I recognize a few faces from the old photos in the archives, men who died in the 40s, men who shouldn't be here. October 8, 1985. Something on the tier calls us officer, like we still work for them, like we're part of the routine. I think it's learning, it knows our names now. January 15, 1986. If you look up when it's on the catwalk, it learns your face. Then it doesn't need the cameras anymore. It can find you anywhere in the building, maybe outside it too. I don't know. I'm not staying to find out. The notebook ended there. No final entry, no explanation, just blank pages. At the bottom of the box, I found a photograph. It was black and white, creased and faded, showing a line of inmates standing in front of Block E, flanked by guards in old-fashioned uniforms. The photo was dated 1947. I studied the faces, stern, tired, blank expressions captured for some forgotten record. And then I saw it in the background, barely visible in the shadows behind the last row of inmates. A figure, tall, too tall, with its hands resting on the shoulders of two men in the front. Its face was blurred, not from motion or poor focus, but as if the camera had refused to capture it properly. The more I stared, the less defined it became, until I had to look away because my eyes were starting to water. I put the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. That night I returned to Saint Laurent with the notebook tucked into my bag. I didn't know what I expected to find. Confirmation, maybe, or a way to rationalize what had happened to Ricky. Duval wasn't there when I arrived. A note on the desk said he'd gone home early. Unwell. I was alone. The shift started quietly. I followed the routine exactly as written, logging every hour, checking the feeds, and avoiding C block. At 1:47 a.m., while reviewing the B block camera, I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps on the catwalk above the control room. They moved with deliberate, measured rhythm matching my own breathing. I froze, staring at the ceiling, and remembered Thibodeau's words. If you look up when it's on the catwalk, it learns your face. I did not look up. The footsteps continued for 30 seconds, directly overhead, then stopped. The building settled into silence again, but I could feel it. A presence, patient and watchful, waiting to see what I would do. I kept my eyes on the monitors and didn't move until my shift ended. I cornered Duval 3 days later, during the narrow window between shifts when he was technically still on the clock and couldn't avoid me. I found him in the parking lot, sitting in his truck with the engine running, staring at the building like he was trying to decide whether to go inside. When I knocked on his window, he flinched. "I need to talk to you," I said. He rolled the window down slowly. "You should quit, Malik." "I'm not quitting until you tell me what the hell is happening in there." "I already told you, follow the rules." "That's not good enough." I pulled the notebook from my bag and held it up. I read Thibodeau's logs. I saw the reports. Ricky's gone and you're acting like it's normal, like it's just another Tuesday. So either you tell me the truth or I start making calls. To the parish, to OSHA, to whoever regulates this place. I'll get it shut down. Duval stared at me for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he turned off the engine and got out of the truck. "You can't shut it down," he said quietly. "People have tried. The state closed it in 2003, locked the doors, transferred the records, sold off the equipment. They even drained the old water tower and cut the power. But the building stayed open, not officially. Nobody lives here, nobody's incarcerated here. But at night, the routine continues. The count gets called, the cells fill up. The system keeps running whether we acknowledge it or not. That doesn't make sense. No, Duval agreed, it doesn't. But that's what makes it true. He gestured toward the building, his expression weary. Saint Laurent isn't haunted in the way people think. It's not ghosts wandering around, reliving their deaths. It's the routine that's haunted, the structure, the schedule. 80 years of the same patterns, day after day, night after night. Wake-up call, count time, meals, lockdown, lights out. Do that long enough in a place like this, and the routine becomes autonomous. It doesn't need guards or inmates anymore, it sustains itself. I stared at him. You're telling me the prison is alive? I'm telling you the prison functions, and it wants participation. It wants us to play our roles. To respond to the count, to unlock the cells, to walk the tiers. Every time someone follows one of those ingrained patterns, it gets stronger, more coherent. And if you break the routine in the wrong way at the wrong time, it takes notice. He paused. Ricky broke the routine. He opened a cell that should have stayed closed. So the prison corrected him. Corrected him how? Where is he? Duval shook his head. I don't know. Maybe he's still in there, part of the count now. Maybe he's somewhere else entirely. The ones who disappear don't come back, Malik. That's the only certainty. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. Then why do you stay? Why keep working here if you know what it is? Because someone has to, Duval said simply. If the night shifts go unstaffed, if there's no one in the control room to not respond, to not follow the prompts. I don't know what happens. Maybe nothing. Maybe it spills over. Maybe the routine finds new participants. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in his eyes. The rules aren't just for your protection, Malik. They're containment protocols. Follow them and the system tolerates your presence. Break them, and you become part of the system. He handed me a folded piece of paper, another addendum to the rules handwritten in his careful script, supplementary protocol, verbal only, not for official log. If you ever see yourself on a camera feed when you know you're not in that location, do not investigate. Do not acknowledge it. That's how it marks you. Once it has your image, it can place you anywhere in the building, and the boundary between observer and participant dissolves. I stared at the note, my hands trembling. Has that happened to you? Duval didn't answer. He just got back in his truck, started the engine, and drove away. That night I returned to Saint Laurent with a new understanding and a deeper, more primal fear. The building wasn't just dangerous, it was intelligent in the way a predator is intelligent. It tested boundaries, it learned patterns, and it was patient. I followed the rules exactly. I did not respond to the count when it was called at 12:41 a.m. I did not look up when the footsteps resumed on the catwalk at 2:15 a.m. I did not acknowledge the soft voice that whispered through the intercom at 3:03 a.m., asking if anyone was there. But at 4:47 a.m., while I was logging the hourly check, I glanced at the monitor for B Block Tier 3, a corridor I hadn't been anywhere near all night, and saw myself. I was standing in the middle of the tier, back to the camera, hands at my sides. Perfectly still. The timestamp in the corner of the feed read 04:47:32, matching the clock on the desk in front of me. I looked down at my own hands, confirming I was still in the control room. Then I looked back at the monitor. The figure, my double, turned slowly as if it had heard something and began walking toward the camera. I switched the feed off. I didn't log the incident. I didn't tell Duval. I just sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the monitors and the distant scrape of metal on metal somewhere deep in the building, and tried not to think about what it meant that the prison had learned my face. The next week passed in a kind of suspended dread. I worked my shifts, followed the rules, and tried to ignore the growing sense that the building was watching me with increasing interest. The figure I'd seen on the B-block camera didn't reappear, but I felt its absence more than its presence. A gap in the routine where something should have been. A space waiting to be filled. The prison was patient. It had been patient for decades. It could afford to wait for me to make a mistake. I almost quit twice. Once on a Tuesday when I woke up in my apartment and realized I couldn't remember driving home from my shift. I couldn't account for the 30-minute gap between leaving St. Laurent and arriving at my front door. And again on a Thursday, when I found a note in my own handwriting tucked into the logbook, a note I didn't remember writing that read, "You're doing well. Keep going." The handwriting was mine, but the phrasing wasn't. I burned the note in the parking lot and tried to convince myself I was just tired, just stressed, just losing track of details because of the isolation and the night schedule. But I didn't quit. I needed the money, and some part of me, some irrational, self-destructive part, wanted to see how far this could go. How much I could endure before the building claimed me the way it had claimed Ricky, the way it had claimed Thibodeau and Landry and all the others whose names had been scratched into the margins of those old reports. On the 15th night, something changed. It started at 1:47 a.m., during the dead hours when the building was at its quietest and the rules felt most like suggestions whispered by a fading memory. I was doing a camera sweep, cycling through the feeds in sequence, when I heard it, weeping. Soft, broken, coming from somewhere deep in the facility. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe the groan of old pipes expanding in the heat, but the sound was too human, too raw. It was a man's voice, choked with sobs, stumbling over words I couldn't quite make out. "Officer, please, I didn't do it." I froze, my hand hovering over the monitor controls. The voice was coming from the direction of the old death row wing, the sealed corridor Duval had told me never to approach, the place where Officer Broussard had died of cardiac arrest in 1989. The voice sounded desperate, genuine, like someone trapped and alone and terrified. I looked down at the rules. Rule 9. Never answer when someone addresses you as officer from the old death row wing. The weeping continued, rising and falling, interspersed with gasping breaths. "Please, I didn't. It wasn't me." I switched to the camera feed for the death row corridor. The angle was poor, an old fixed camera mounted near the entrance gate, showing only the first 20 feet of the hallway before the image dissolved into shadows. But I could see something there. Just at the edge of the light, a figure sitting against the wall, knees drawn up to its chest, head bowed. The posture was unmistakable, defeated, broken. Somebody, please. I knew the rules. I understood what Duval had said. But as I sat there listening to that voice crack and splinter, I thought about my brother. About the 3 years he'd spent in a parish jail for a crime he didn't commit. About the letters he'd sent me that I'd never answered because I didn't know what to say. About the way he'd looked when they finally let him out. Hollowed, older, like something essential had been carved out of him. What if this was real? What if someone had been left behind, overlooked when the prison closed, trapped in the bureaucratic cracks of a system that didn't care? I picked up the radio and hesitated. Then I keyed the intercom for the death row wing, a channel I wasn't supposed to access, a button Duval had covered with electrical tape months ago. The tape was already peeling. I pressed it. "Who's there?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The weeping stopped immediately. For a moment there was only silence, so complete and absolute that I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then the figure on the monitor moved. Slowly, as if waking from a long sleep, it lifted its head. The camera struggled to focus. The image flickered, pixelated, distorted by interference. But I could see the face now, or rather the place where a face should have been. The features were blurred like a photograph taken through frosted glass, but the eyes were clear. Too clear, too bright. They stared directly at the camera, directly at me, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Been waiting on you, officer," the voice said. It was different now, calmer, more measured, with an undercurrent of satisfaction. "Count's not done, come finish it." Every intercom speaker in the prison crackled to life simultaneously, filling the building with overlapping static and the echo of that voice, repeating the same words over and over. "Come finish it, come finish it, come finish it." The temperature in the control room plummeted. My breath fogged in the air, and I could see frost forming on the edges of the monitors. I reached for the intercom controls, trying to shut it off, but the system didn't respond. The voice continued, louder now, layered and distorted, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "You answered, you acknowledged, come finish the count." I killed the main power to the intercom system, yanking the breaker with shaking hands. The voices stopped abruptly, leaving only the hum of the monitors and the sound of my own ragged breathing. On the death row camera, the figure was gone. The corridor was empty. But I could feel it now, a presence moving through the building, no longer confined to camera feeds or distant corridors. It was aware of me. It knew I'd responded. And in doing so, I'd confirmed that I was part of the routine, a participant rather than an observer. I looked back at the monitor bank and my blood turned to ice. On every single feed, every camera and every wing of St. Laurent Penitentiary, I saw myself. Standing in corridors I'd never entered, facing away from the camera, hands at my sides, perfectly still. Dozens of me, scattered throughout the building, waiting. I switched off the monitors one by one until the control room was dark except for the glow of the emergency lights. I sat in the silence, listening to the faint scrape of metal somewhere above me, and realized I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The prison had been testing me. Now it knew I would answer. 3 nights later, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. A slow grinding system that turned the sky black and filled the swamp with the sound of rain hammering against cypress and concrete. By the time my shift started, the power at St. Laurent was flickering, the wind howling through broken windows on the upper floors, and the whole building felt like it was holding its breath. Duval met me in the parking lot, rain streaming off his jacket, his face drawn and pale. "You answered," he said. Not a question, a statement. I nodded. "Then tonight's going to be bad." He handed me a flashlight and a backup radio. "Don't leave the control room, no matter what you hear, no matter what the system tells you to do. If the power goes out, stay where you are and wait for dawn. Understand?" "What if?" "There's no what if, Malik. You broke the routine. Now it's going to test how far it can push you." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve this." He drove away and I was alone. The storm hit full force around 10:30 p.m., and by 11 the lights in the control room were flickering like dying fireflies. I logged the start of my shift, checked the cameras, and tried to ignore the way the building seemed to shift and settle around me as if adjusting its weight. The feeds were unstable, half of them showing static, the others cutting in and out at random intervals. On the ones that still worked, I saw empty corridors, rain leaking through the roof, shadows that moved just beyond the range of the cameras. At 11:53 p.m., the main power failed. The control room plunged into darkness, lit only by the pale red glow of the emergency lights. The monitors went black. The hum of the HVAC system stopped, leaving only the sound of rain and wind and my own breathing. I clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark, and waited. At 12 a.m. Exactly, the intercom roared to life, louder than I'd ever heard it, the voice distorted and furious. Count time. Officer Hayes, report to the tier, count time. My name. It used my name. The backup generator kicked in with a stuttering groan, and the monitors flickered back on, all except 3, which remained black. The ones that worked showed the same image on every screen. C Block Tier 1, fully occupied. Dozens of figures standing at their cell doors, hands on bars, faces turned upward. The image was clearer now, more defined than it had ever been. I could see their features, the worn fabric of their jumpsuits, the way their breath fogged in the cold air. They were waiting. Count time. Acknowledge presence. Confirm head count. An alarm panel I didn't recognize lit up on the desk, flashing red and yellow. Manual count override required. Below it, a prompt blinked on a small screen. Officer Hayes, report to C Block Tier 1 for mandatory count. The system knew me. Not just my name, it had integrated me into its routine. I stared at the panel, my mind racing. If I ignored it, what would happen? Would the prison escalate? Would it force me out of the control room, drag me into the tiers the way it had taken Ricky? Or would it simply wait, patient and eternal, until I made a mistake? The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, on the catwalk above the control room. Directly overhead. I didn't look up. When the lights came back on, the footsteps were descending the metal staircase outside the control room door. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, closer. I grabbed the radio. Duval, if you're listening. Static. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I turned slowly and saw the doorknob begin to turn. Then on the monitors, every camera feed changed simultaneously. They all showed the same thing, me. Standing in different locations throughout the prison, C Block Tier 1, death row, the execution chamber, the yard. Each version of me was facing away from the camera, head slightly bowed, hands at my sides. And as I watched, each figure began to turn. One by one, they turned toward the camera and their faces came into view. My face, repeated across a dozen screens, but wrong. The eyes too bright, the expressions too still, like masks that had learned to mimic humanity but couldn't quite get it right. On the last screen, B Block Tier 3, my double smiled. Count time, the intercom voice said again, softer now, almost coaxing. Come finish the count, Officer Hayes. They're waiting for you. The doorknob stopped turning. I made my choice. I stood up, walked to the main breaker panel, and shut down the power to C Block entirely. Not just the lights, but everything. Cameras, locks, intercom, the whole grid. The building groaned in protest, metal shrieking against metal, and for a moment I thought I'd gone too far, that I'd triggered something irreversible. Then the alarm stopped. The intercom went silent. On the monitors, the C Block feed went black, completely, utterly dark. No emergency lights, no faint glow from the perimeter. Just an absence so total it felt like staring into a void. And in that void I saw them. Dozens of pairs of eyes, faint and luminous, arranged in the same pattern as the inmates had been standing. They blinked, slowly, one by one, and then went out. The footsteps outside the door retreated up the staircase, fading into the storm. The other camera feeds returned to normal. Empty corridors, rain, darkness. The figures of me were gone. I collapsed back into the chair, my hands shaking so badly I could barely write the log entry. C Block power failure, 12:14 a.m. Manual shutdown initiated to prevent system malfunction. Count override ignored. I didn't mention the eyes. I didn't mention my name being called. I didn't mention the doorknob turning. I just sat in the dark, listening to the rain, and waited for dawn. The storm broke just before 6 a.m. leaving the air thick and heavy with the smell of wet earth and ozone. I logged the end of my shift with hands that still trembled, my handwriting barely legible. The monitors had stabilized, showing nothing but empty corridors and the slow drip of rainwater through the ancient roof. C-Block remained dark. I hadn't restored power, and I wasn't planning to. When Duval's truck pulled into the lot, I was already outside, standing in the gravel with my bag over my shoulder, ready to leave and never come back. He got out slowly, limping worse than usual, and looked at me with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "You shut down C-Block," he said. "Yeah." "How bad was it?" "Bad enough." He walked past me into the building, and I followed, reluctant but needing to see his reaction. In the control room, he scanned the logs, checked the breaker panel, and studied the blank monitor for C-Block. Then he turned to me, and for the first time since I'd met him, he smiled. A small, weary expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You told it no," he said quietly. "Most people don't. They follow the prompts, play along, and figure compliance is safer than resistance. But you cut the power. You refused to participate." He nodded slowly. "That's good. That's how you survive here." "I don't want to survive here," I said. "I want to leave. I want this place torn down, buried, erased." "Can't the state do something?" Duval shook his head. "You can close the doors, Malik. You can turn off the lights, drain the pipes, and tear down the fences. Hell, you can bulldoze the whole building into the swamp if you want. But the routine stays. It's not in the concrete or the steel, it's in the pattern. 80 years of the same schedule, the same movements, the same voices calling count in the dark. That kind of repetition, it leaves a mark. An echo. This place is just where the echo is loudest." "Then what's the point?" I asked. "If it can't be stopped, why do we keep working here?" "Why keep staffing the night shifts?" "Because it needs a witness," Duval said. "Something to orient itself around. If there's no one here to not follow the prompts, to not answer the count, then the routine starts looking for participants elsewhere. It spreads. Last time the night shifts went unstaffed, back in 2004, right after the state closure, 3 people in the nearest town reported hearing the count time called in their homes. One of them was a former guard who'd worked here in the 90s. He was found in his basement, standing in front of a blank wall, facing it like he was at a cell door. Heart attack, they said. But I know better. I stared at him. "You're telling me we're containment." "I'm telling you we're a buffer. The rules keep us outside the routine. As long as someone's here, following protocol, refusing to participate, the system stays focused on the prison. It doesn't wander." He paused, his expression darkening. "But you answered, Malik. You acknowledged it. That makes you a point of contact now. It knows your face, your name, your patterns. Even if you quit, it might not let go." I thought about the figures I'd seen on the monitors, dozens of versions of myself scattered throughout the building, waiting in empty corridors. The way the doorknob had turned, the footsteps on the catwalk. "So what do I do?" I asked. "You follow the rules," Duval said. "Exactly, every shift. No improvisation, no exceptions. You don't answer, don't investigate, don't look up. And you hope that's enough." He left me alone in the control room, and I sat there for a long time, staring at the laminated rule sheet taped above the monitors. The words looked different now, not like guidelines, but like a contract I'd signed without understanding the terms. I went home and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the intercom voice calling my name. I heard footsteps overhead. I heard the scrape of metal in the walls, and I couldn't tell if it was memory or if the prison had followed me home. 3 nights later, I returned for my next shift. I didn't want to. Every rational part of me screamed to walk away, to find another job, to leave Louisiana entirely. But Duval's warning echoed in my mind. Even if you quit, it might not let go. And beneath that was a darker truth. I needed to know if I could still control this, if the rules still held power, if I could keep myself outside the routine. When I arrived, the control room felt different, smaller. The air was colder and the shadows seemed to press in closer than before. I logged the start of my shift and checked the monitors. Everything appeared normal. Empty tiers, locked doors, rain beginning to fall again outside. Then I saw it. A new line at the bottom of the laminated rule sheet, written in handwriting that wasn't mine or Duval's. The ink looked fresh, as if someone had added it while I wasn't looking. Rule 10. If the count ever reaches your number, don't come back for another shift. I picked up the sheet, hands shaking, and flipped it over. On the back, in the same unfamiliar script, was a single sentence. Welcome to the roster, Officer Hayes. I turned to the desk where the staff roster from the 1980s was pinned to the corkboard. A yellowed document listing guard names, shift assignments, and employee numbers. My name had been added at the bottom, written in the same ink as Rule 10, with a number beside it, 067. I hadn't written it. Duval hadn't written it. But there it was, integrated into the prison's records as if I'd always been part of the system. I looked at the monitors, my heart pounding, and saw C-Block Tier 1 flickering back to life. The power was still shut off. I'd confirmed it with Duval that morning, but the camera feed was active, showing the long corridor lit by a faint, sourceless glow. The inmates were there again, standing at their doors, hands on bars. And at the far end of the tier, near cell C12, I saw a new figure. A man in a security uniform holding a clipboard, head bowed as if marking names. The figure looked up. It had my face. I quit the next morning. I didn't tell Duval face to face. I couldn't. I left a note on the control room desk, packed my things from the sparse locker they'd given me, and drove away from St. Laurent Penitentiary without looking back. In my rearview mirror, the building shrank into the swamp, swallowed by mist and distance. But I could still feel it watching. Still feel the weight of my name on that roster, inked into a document that shouldn't have included me. For 3 weeks, I convinced myself I was free. I picked up work at a warehouse in Lafayette, found a cheaper apartment, and tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night I heard the count time called in the dark. Every night I saw myself standing in those empty corridors, clipboard in hand, marking names I couldn't read. And every morning I woke up with the taste of rust and mildew in my mouth, as if I'd spent the night breathing the air of St. Laurent. On the 23rd day after I quit, I woke to find muddy boot prints leading from my front door to my bedroom. My boots. The same treads, the same wear patterns, but I'd been asleep. I hadn't gone anywhere. The prints stopped at the foot of my bed. I didn't go back to St. Laurent, but I called Duval. He didn't answer. I left 3 messages, each more desperate than the last, and finally he called me back on a Sunday morning. "It doesn't end when you quit," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I told you that." "What do I do?" I asked. "You live with it. You follow your own rules now. Don't answer when you hear your name at night. Don't look at reflections too long. And don't, under any circumstances, come back here. The further you stay from the building, the weaker the connection gets. Eventually it might let you go." "Might? It's the best I can offer." He hung up. I stayed in Lafayette. I worked my shifts at the warehouse, kept my head down, and tried to ignore the feeling that I was always being watched. Some nights were better than others. Some nights I didn't dream at all. But other nights when the humidity was high and the air felt heavy. Nights when I could smell swamp water even though I was miles from the nearest bayou. I heard footsteps in my apartment, slow, deliberate, circling. and I knew with cold certainty that the prison hadn't forgotten me. Meanwhile, St. Laurent Penitentiary posted a new job listing. Night security, historical facility, quiet environment, $13.50 HR. The ad ran in the Vermilion Parish Classifieds, buried between listings for farm equipment and part-time custodial work. It didn't mention the rules. It didn't mention the routine. It just promised easy money and minimal supervision. Janelle Broussard, 28, recently divorced and behind on rent, saw the ad on a Tuesday. She applied on Wednesday. By Friday, she was sitting in Captain Duval's truck driving down the access road toward the prison for the first time. Duval gave her the same tour he'd given me. The control room, the camera feeds, the locked wings, the keys she must never use. And at the end, just as the sun was setting and the mosquitoes were rising from the swamp, he handed her the laminated rule sheet. Janelle read it, her brow furrowing, and laughed nervously. "Is this for real?" she asked. "Or are y'all just trying to scare the rookie?" Duval's expression didn't change. "Read them, follow them, and don't answer when the prison calls you officer." He left her alone in the control room. Janelle settled into the desk chair, adjusting the monitors, flipping through the logbook. The first few hours were quiet, so quiet she almost fell asleep twice. But at 11:47 p.m., one of the monitors flickered. The feed for C Block Tier 1 came to life, even though Duval had told her that the wing's power was offline for maintenance. On the screen, she saw a long corridor lit by a faint, sourceless glow. Cell doors lined both sides, and standing at each door, hands on the bars, were figures in faded jumpsuits. Dozens of them waiting. At the far end of the tier, near cell C12, a man in a security uniform stood with a clipboard, his back to the camera. As Janelle watched, the figure turned slowly. She couldn't see his face clearly. The image was too grainy, too distorted, but she saw enough. The shape of his jaw, the way he held himself. The number stitched onto his uniform, Zagrezo 67. The intercom crackled. "Count time." Janelle froze, her hand hovering over the radio. The rule sheet was taped above the monitor. Rule 2 highlighted in yellow. "If you hear count time called over the intercom after midnight, do not respond and do not leave the control room." But it wasn't midnight yet. It was only 11:53. The voice came again, louder now, more insistent. "Count time. Officer Broussard, report to the tier." Her name. It already knew her name. Janelle looked at the monitor, at the line of inmates standing at their doors, at the man with the clipboard who was now facing the camera fully. His face was blurred, indistinct, but his eyes were clear. Too clear. Bright and fixed and utterly inhuman. The figure raised one hand and pointed directly at the camera, directly at her. "Come finish the count." The lights in the control room flickered. Janelle grabbed the rule sheet, her hands shaking, and read through it again, searching for guidance, for some instruction that would tell her what to do. But there were no answers. Only warnings, only boundaries, only the imperative to stay outside the routine. The intercom hissed with static, and beneath it she heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, climbing the metal staircase outside the control room. She looked at the door. The doorknob began to turn, and somewhere deep in St. Laurent Penitentiary, in a darkness that had waited patiently for decades, the count continued.